Okay, this is the second part of the Renaissance lecture, and this one deals more with the exploration factor. And the point I want to make overall in this about 10 to 15-minute lecture is um, that the Europeans are just beginning to flex their muscles across the globe. If you think about World Civ II as really the rise and fall of Europe, basically 1492 to 1945, that's kind of a part of the giant narrative of this class. It makes some sense, and in a lot of ways, if you think what they call the French historians call the longue durée, this idea of looking at history in big chunks, it kind of falls that way. And in some ways, even here in 2021, that we're still kind of wrestling with the falling apart of Europe because of World War II. And how the rest of the world's reacting to that, just as much as the rest of the world was reacting to the age of exploration of Portuguese sailors sailing around the coast of West Africa to find a quicker route to the Indian Ocean. Part of this is to do trade in the Indian Ocean with the cultures there. The Mongolian Empire had kind of started to link up, renewed trade once again. But, the Europeans are looking for a way to cut off basically the Islamic middleman, and things are just trying to find a quicker, easier route. And I think one of the questions I got from this book in particular, The Origins of the Modern World by Robert Marks, when I first started teaching World Civ 2 about 10 years ago, this book was really helpful for me to kind of question my own Eurocentrism, understand that Europe is again kind of awakening from what you might call the Dark Ages, and that it was Europe that wants to go out of its borders to do trade with other countries. And sure, cultures like in China and elsewhere didn't mind and would like to trade with the Europeans, but it was the Europeans who were the ones who were really pushing the push for trade. They're the ones that needed it. And if you think about the realm of technology, just look at this image here. The difference between Chinese warships of the 15th century and one of Columbus's ships. So there's no question on what culture at this point has a stronger navy and technology. But this is all part of the quote unquote story of rise, that once you get into the 18th century industrial revolution, things begin to shift for global politics. Now, the first Europeans to really start to spread were the Portuguese, and frankly, the beginning of our story really does start with the Iberian Peninsula, or what we know as of Spain and Portugal. As you'll see in the next slide, they were in this kind of very dramatic war with Islam throughout the centuries. In some ways, a crusader mindset had taken over Spain after living through Al Andalusia and this time period has been called the Ornament of the World of Islamic Spain. But following the 11th century, you start having tensions and troubles, and eventually, by the time of Columbus, Spain is completely under Christian control. More of that in a second. But Portugal had already done that, and under Henry the Navigator, they have already begun to push for exploration around the African world. Now, Africa was not unknown to the Europeans. They had traded there before. We were talking about Northern Africa. You are talking mostly a lot of Islamic civilizations and kingdoms. But as the notes show here, you do get Portugal becoming way more involved in the African world, even helping Ethiopia in pushing back a Muslim invasion, and toying around with sending missionaries to convert Ethiopia, who has generally been a Christian nation since like the third century, fourth century. And eventually the Ethiopians will expel the Spanish missionaries. So right there, that's a little jump ahead in the story, but it does show you that the Portuguese are the ones that start to touch down on African shores and will even end up on East African shore. That's where Ethiopia is on the Indian Ocean side, and begin to use missionaries and use naval vessels to go set port, do trade, but even start to get involved in the politics. And obviously, the most infamous aspect of this is that the Portuguese are going to be the ones to introduce the Atlantic slave trade to the Atlantic Ocean, or to traveling to the Americas. So more of that in a second. All right. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, there's a lot going on this slide here. So let me just kind of summarize things. You have my notes to take a look at them in more detail. But it is this kind of the Spanish Portuguese world, Iberian Peninsula. This is where everything kind of starts for the modern age, right? So that's what it looks like here. So you have at 1482 literally the combination, or you had first the combination of the House of Castile and Aragon with the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand, and then by 1492 the Reconquista has been completed. Granada was the last territory that Muslims had some autonomy control over. It's been kind of a decade after decade push to kind of take over the whole peninsula. And then again, this I think it fills in the information on how we understand this reality between the Western European world and its other. The Alhambra Decree, or the expulsion in 1492, literally before Columbus will end up in the Caribbean, the Spanish will expel unbaptized Jews and Muslims. And for those Muslims and Spanish Jews that stay behind, the Spanish Inquisition is initiated to basically hunt out and find anyone they think isn't really converted to Christianity. So it's a very terrible time. In fact, it also leads to a giant decrease in intellectual capital, because Spanish Jews and Muslims will then go into the North African world or into the Ottoman Empire in present day Turkey, or some will flee up into Northern Europe, especially European Jews. So you're losing a lot, and in some ways, the question you should be asking is, well, why don't we really talk about Spain very much when it comes to world history? Really, we end up here, right? Columbus lands on Hispaniola. He initiates basically the takeover of the Caribbean, and then the encomienda system set up where the Spanish, including conquistadors and priests, come in and begin to force the native population to begin doing labor for them. The biggest story out of this with realm of conquistadors has to do with about a decade or so later, Cortez going with a band of soldiers over to the Aztec Empire, and with some allies or indigenous allies that he makes on the way, he is able to defeat the Aztec Empire and take over the capital of Tenochtitlan, which, by all accounts from the Spanish, was impressive. We do a disservice to the Aztecs. We think it's some like hole in the wall. No, this is one of the greatest capitals probably in the world at its time period. The Aztec Empire in of itself had only been around for about 100 years and was on a kind of continual rise. There's one reason why some of the other indigenous communities wanted to see it fall. I mean, a lot of it had to do with the bloodletting, human sacrifice. About a decade later, Francisco Pizarro will lead forces down in Peru and will take over that kingdom. A lot of it is they pop up right at the right time. It's where there's a transfer of power that happens between brothers, and they choose a guy, then turn on the guy, and then are able to kind of take control. And you know the issue about race. You could read some of the black conquistadors there, like Juan Garrido, who was part of Cortez's force. So you do have stories of Spanish black conquistadors that were in part of these conquistador battles. And one of the things that this does, we come back to this slide, is it overthrows some of our understanding again about that question of humanity. You see some very early modern art that she features portraits of obviously African men, and they, you know, have full humanity in the artwork. They're the corrupt view of people of from Africa as slave like. Etc., is something that is going to be developed and actually gets worse as time goes on, especially with the advent of the rise of modern science. So, more of that later. Now, the question of, you know, where this racism come from and where the utilization of African slaves come from, that let me just go into that in a second. First of all, real quick, we want to talk about the way the church got involved. The church actually, you know, looked at the Portuguese and the Spanish now moving out in the oceans and you know playing their flag in these new territories. And what the church did was basically said like, okay, on the right of the line, Portugal is going to gain that territory, and then on the left of the line, that territory will go to the Spanish. And so you can look at this map here, you can see how the Americas are mostly now under the Spanish category, and that would also include even the Philippines, which is another territory that's become Spanish. So if you think of all the area that's becomes Hispanic or Spanish. You know, a lot of this has to do with the Pope drawing these lines, and how in the Americas, basically Brazil gets the Portuguese trade off in this. In fact, Portugal was really slow about moving towards the New World, and only once you know things really started got rolling, you know, they start to go into Brazil and start to create a plantation system there. Yeah, so this leads into this question, and so eventually, you know, as you're probably well aware of, the indigenous population of the Americas was one. Most of the deaths were from war and overwork and slavery, basically. A lot of historians nowadays say, you know, we're talking upwards in the upper hundreds of thousands to the millions of people died within 100 years. I mean, Toll Island completely decimated. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous the loss of life that happened within from 1492 to 1592. So that's one aspect of the story. The disease is another aspect. But, you know, there was a debate that went over about the humanity of the indigenous people. And this is a famous Las Casas versus Sepulveda debate. Las Casas was a former encomienda. He actually profited from, making indigenous people work for him. And then he had a moment of conscience and he began to be the greatest advocate for freedom for the indigenous people. And this is the reason why eventually African slavery begins to ramp up. You're having a major loss of life. One, so many indigenous people are dying. But number two, because of disease and slavery. But number two, the Spanish crown actually backs up Las Casas. It says like, well, indigenous slavery needs to end. So at a certain point, indigenous slavery, I mean, they're the type of slavery that happens, but like basically the coordinated, in your face kind of slavery was somewhat curtailed. What basically comes in to try to take its place is, or doesn't come in, it literally does take its place, is the African slavery. So that's kind of the negative side effect that eventually happens. So you can look at this slide. A lot of this goes over some of the stuff I already talked about, the way the Portuguese had set up on the west coast of Africa and began to trade with African kingdoms on the west coast. And so my notes there basically do go over kind of the ins and outs of that relationship and shows that, yes, there were some African kingdoms that traded with the Portuguese and even sent their sons to study in Europe. But you also get people like Queen Nzinga, the Dongo who resisted as well.